On Christmas night, my dad pointed his knife at me and said, "Get up, leave this table. You do not belong here." The room fell silent in a way that felt physical, as if someone had closed their hands around the air itself. I sat there with the light from the chandelier warming the mashed potatoes on my plate, while something colder than winter settled under my skin. I am Nora Blake, 29, the quiet one who minds her bills and her work. My brother Evan is the golden child, and my parents have always made sure I understood exactly where I stood in that hierarchy. Dad held his knife a little higher, as if the gesture itself carried authority, and repeated, "Leave. Right now." His voice did not rise, but the quiet was sharper than shouting. My mother did not look up from her plate. She simply murmured, "Do not make a scene." Nora, as if the scene was something I had created rather than something being done to me. Evan leaned back in his chair and let a slow, amused smile stretch across his face. "You heard him. Do not ruin Christmas again." My heart thudded once heavy enough to feel like a bruise, then again faster, irregular, almost frantic, though my face stayed still, because stillness was the only shield I had ever been allowed. I wrapped my fingers around my water glass to ground myself, but the condensation only made my hand slip, and the glass rattled against the plate. No one reached out. No one blinked. I lifted my eyes one by one to each face around the table, searching for something, a flicker, hesitation, doubt, but every expression told me the same story I had lived since childhood. I was the easy one to blame, the easy one to push aside, the one expected to absorb the impact. A familiar numbness crept up the back of my neck, the same numbness that had kept me silent through years of subtle dismissals and casual cruelty. They thought that numbness meant obedience. They thought it meant weakness. My smartwatch buzzed lightly against my wrist, almost like it was reminding me it existed, and I let my gaze drop to it for a fraction of a second. I had already heard worse words from him, just not in front of witnesses. I inhaled, slowly stood up without scraping the chair, and for a moment simply looked at the table that had always felt like a test I could never pass. No yelling, no tears, no pleading. I reached into my coat pocket and placed my phone in the center of the table near the cranberry sauce. My hand moved calmly, even though I could feel my pulse hammering in my fingertips. "If you want me gone, Dad, they should at least hear why." My voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. A confused flicker crossed his face, the first crack in his certainty. Before he could respond, I tapped my screen. A recorded conversation played, instantly filling the warm room with a cold truth. Charles' voice sounded different when forced into permanence, lower and edged with calculation. "The trust, $4.2 million, all under her name, if the IRS comes knocking." The scrape of a fork froze mid-air. Evan's smirk collapsed into something closer to panic. His wife's hand flew to her mouth. My mother whispered, "Turn it off," but it came out thin, like she already knew it would not stop. Dad's jaw tightened as he leaned forward, but he did not reach for the phone. Maybe he knew touching it would make everything worse, or maybe he finally understood that the control he assumed he held over me did not extend to recorded evidence. I felt the shift in the room like a tide pulling back, exposing what had always been there, but never seen. For the first time in my life, I was not the one expected to shrink or apologize or carry the weight of their decisions. They were the ones shrinking now. They were the ones who looked small. And for the first time in my life, I was not the one leaving the table in shame. They were. 9 months earlier, a white envelope from the IRS landed in my mailbox. March in Sacramento has a way of pretending to be spring, while the air still carries a winter chill, and that afternoon in my small apartment, the light came in through the blinds in thin, pale stripes. I had kicked off my shoes after work and was sorting the day's mail with the same steady habit I used for everything in my life. Bills, a coupon flyer, a letter from the IRS. I almost set it aside because tax season always brings a flood of notices for the law firm where I work, and my eyes were tired from staring at spreadsheets. But my name was printed alone on the front, with no firm address beneath it. I felt a faint tightening in my jaw as I tore the envelope open. The first line pulled the air out of the room. Notice of discrepancy regarding Blake Family Trust. Beneficiary. Nora Blake. I read it again slower, as if it would rearrange into something ordinary. It did not. There, in plain text, was the number $4.2 million linked to a trust I had never known existed. I stood still for a moment, with the paper trembling slightly between my fingers. I live simply. I wake before sunrise. I run the same 3-mile loop. I pack my lunch in the same glass container. I rent a 1-bedroom unit near downtown and work as a data forensics analyst for a mid-sized law firm. My life is built on quiet routines because they are predictable and safe. Nothing in it has ever brushed anywhere near $4.2 million. My first reaction was shock, sharp, immediate. Then came a numbness that felt almost practiced, and after that, a flicker of doubt. Had I signed something years ago? Had I forgotten something important? Had my family told me something once that I brushed aside because it came mixed with criticism the way everything did? But I knew the answer, even before the questions finished forming. If anything involving millions of dollars had ever included my name, my parents would have used it to remind me of what they claimed I owed them. They would never have let me forget it. I lowered myself into the chair by my small kitchen table and let my eyes trace the lines of the notice. Discrepancy. Beneficiary. Review required. Then the final line that made my stomach tighten. Any intentional misrepresentation may result in civil and criminal penalties imposed on the beneficiary. I leaned back and shut my eyes. Civil and criminal penalties for something I had never heard of. Something someone had apparently attached to my name. I rubbed my forehead, feeling the early tremor of anger beneath the shock. A memory surfaced uninvited. My mother waving her hand dismissively during a conversation years ago when Evan was discussing investment choices and market swings. These money matters are not for you, Nora. Let the men handle it. I had been so used to being dismissed that the words slid off me than the way rain slides down a window pane. Now they hit me differently. They sounded less like dismissal and more like warning disguised as condescension. I opened my eyes and stared at the IRS letter again, letting the meaning settle fully. Someone had used my name in a legal structure worth millions. Someone had placed responsibility on me without my knowledge. Someone had counted on me being quiet and harmless enough not to question it. My pulse sped up, but my breathing stayed controlled. Years of training myself to remain steady in stressful situations paid off. My job requires that steadiness. People assume data forensics analysts stare at numbers, but what I truly stare at are patterns, irregularities, metadata anomalies, hidden trails that others try to bury. I have spent years helping attorneys untangle fraudulent filings and suspicious transfers. My brain slips into analytical gear almost without my permission. It did now. I pulled my laptop toward me and opened it as naturally as taking another breath. My fingers typed before my thoughts caught up. IRS portal, login, 2-factor verification. I did not notice the way my shoulders straightened or how my mind sharpened. It was instinct, a familiar switch flipping in the dark. I scanned the notice again to confirm the trust name, then copied it into the search bar. Blake Family Trust. A trust tied to my last name, my family name. My chair creaked as I leaned forward. The absurdity of it would have made me laugh if not for the cold weight forming behind my ribs. I clicked through the menu options the way I have done for countless cases at work. Filing history, status notes, discrepancy flags. I reached for my glass of water, but my hand stopped halfway because my thoughts were racing faster than my ability to keep up with them. If this trust existed since before today, why had no one ever mentioned it? Why was my name on it? Why was there a discrepancy large enough to trigger IRS involvement? Why $4.2 million? And then the real question, heavier than all the others combined. What exactly had my family done with my name? I exhaled slowly, a breath that felt heavier than the one before it. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. The world outside went quiet in a way that tells you life is about to split into a before and an after. I lifted the letter once more and read the final sentence out loud because hearing it made it real. Any intentional misrepresentation may result in civil and criminal penalties imposed on the beneficiary. My voice sounded thinner than usual, but steady. Beneficiary? Of what? I drove to Folsom the following Saturday with a packed container of pasta salad in my passenger seat, so it would look like I was genuinely coming for dinner and not for what I was actually there to do. The late afternoon sun hit the neighborhood in that familiar warm tone that used to make me feel safe before I understood that safety in that house only existed when I stayed quiet. My parents greeted me with the usual scripted warmth, and Evan was apparently running late, which worked in my favor. I set the food in the kitchen, then slipped down the hall toward my father's home office, while my mother fussed with the oven. I had grown up in this house and knew every squeaky board. I knew which parts of the hallway carpet gave just enough cushion to hide steps, and which did not. When I reached the office door, I tried the handle and felt relief wash over me when it turned easily. The room smelled like old paper and furniture polish, and my eyes adjusted to the dim light coming from a single desk lamp that had been left on. I went straight to the tall cabinet on the right wall. My father used to brag that he kept everything there from mortgage papers to investment statements. He had even joked once that he did not need a safe when he had a locked cabinet and 2 obedient children. My fingers moved quickly but carefully across the rows of folders. Blake Family Trust. The words hit me with the same jolt as the IRS notice had. I slid the folder out and rested it on the desk. Inside was a stack of photocopies. The top sheet was dated 2014 and clearly labeled with the trust valuation, at that time $2.8 million. I stared at the number until my throat tightened. At 21 years old, I was eating granola bars for dinner to save money. Meanwhile, there had been a trust worth millions, and somehow my name had been tied to it. I flipped to the next page. Primary beneficiary, Nora Blake. My name looked foreign in that position, as if it belonged to another person. Then I saw the signature. Nora. But it was not my signature. It was slanted in a rushed, awkward style that looked nothing like my steady handwriting. Someone had signed for me. Someone had used my name in an official document tied to substantial value. I lifted the page closer to the light, and my chest grew tight as a memory came forward with unwelcome clarity. A family celebration in 2014. Champagne glasses refilled again and again, while my father laughed louder each time I said I was fine. I remember standing unsteadily. I remember my mother guiding my elbow toward a chair. After that, the night dissolved into a blur. I had never questioned it beyond embarrassment at letting myself get that drunk. But now, a sickening realization pressed in. Had I signed something that night? Or had someone signed for me while I was too far gone to notice? My stomach twisted. The silence in the office felt heavier than the air had any right to be. I shuffled the papers again, looking for clues, notes scribbled in the margins, filing references, annotations in my father's handwriting that read, routine and beneficiary acknowledgement. I knew immediately this document was not an accident. This was intentional. I slid the papers back into the folder just as the door swung open behind me. My father's shadow hit the wall before I heard his voice. "You know better than to go through my cabinets." His tone was cold and sharp, the kind of tone that told me I had crossed an invisible line. I turned slowly, aware that the folder was still in my hand. My mother's voice floated down the hallway from the kitchen, sounding as if it had been rehearsed. "Leave your dad's things alone, Nora." I forced a small, weak smile, hoping it masked the rapid beat of my heart. "I'm sorry," I murmured lightly, and eased the folder back into the cabinet as if I had simply been curious about old family photos. My father watched me with a look that was not anger, but something more guarded, something like calculation. I stepped past him to leave the room, and his eyes followed me long enough to confirm he did not believe my excuse. I walked down the hall toward the kitchen, keeping my breathing even though my thoughts were anything but calm. The doubt that had lingered since the IRS letter shifted quickly into certainty. This was not a misunderstanding. This was something they had done knowingly. I helped my mother set the table. I poured myself water. I made small talk. But beneath every movement ran a new undercurrent, a quiet realization that my family had used me in a way that stripped away any illusion of innocence. After dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom and closed the door behind me just long enough to steady my hands. The copy was old, but the damage was fresh. I whispered the words because saying them made the truth louder. If they used my name, the data will tell me how. The following afternoon, I sat alone in my office in downtown Sacramento while the rest of the building emptied for the weekend. The quiet felt different now, not peaceful but charged with a purpose that steadied my breath. I powered on my desktop computer and the familiar hum filled the room. The light from the screen washed across my desk as I logged into the IRS portal with the trust name I had memorized the night before. Blake Family Trust. My fingers moved quickly through the authentication steps. Years of working with sensitive case files meant this routine required no thought. When the portal opened, the first thing I saw was a list of filings spanning years. Each entry carried the same line in the review field, reviewed by beneficiary, Nora Blake. My stomach tightened. I clicked into the most recent filing. There was my name again placed as if I had personally confirmed the accuracy of every number. I had never touched a single document. I moved into the filing history and followed links that led to scanned bank statements tied to the trust. The numbers were hard to ignore. One transaction showed a withdrawal of $120,000 labeled as loan to Blake Logistics, LLC. I scrolled further. $250,000. Again loan to Blake Logistics, LLC, then $400,000. The pattern was unmistakable. My father and Evan had used a trust tied to my name to funnel money into Evan's business under the appearance of legitimate loans. I leaned in closer as if proximity would help me understand how easily they had written my name into the structure of their financial choices. Each filing included my supposed approval. Each withdrawal framed as if I had reviewed and consented to it. I felt something inside me quietly break and then settle into place in a way that felt both painful and clarifying. All the years of being told to sign here or look this over were not family chores. They were a setup. I remembered my father placing a stack of papers in front of me when I was in college. Sign here. It is just routine. I am your father. I would not hurt you. I had believed him. I had wanted to believe him. I forced my gaze back to the screen and kept reading. Every line confirmed the same truth. I had not been a beneficiary. I had been a shield. They had used my name to insulate themselves from risk while drawing money for Evan's company, and they had done it assuming I would never notice. The ache that rose in my chest did not feel like heartbreak. It felt like awakening. I sat back and let a slow, cold breath escape. The shock had faded. What replaced it was something steadier, a kind of control that came from seeing the full pattern for the first time. I dragged my cursor to the side menu and opened another set of documents. These were older statements scanned in low resolution, but the transactions were clear. Repeated loans, repeated approvals, repeated notes implying my consent. My jaw tightened. I opened another folder on my desktop labeled Personal Cases. Inside were spreadsheets and documents from the times I had assisted attorneys on large fraud cases. I had traced hidden accounts. I had uncovered falsified filings. I had pieced together entire schemes from scattered data fragments. She had taken down strangers for less. Doing this to her own family would take more than skill. It would take a choice. The line formed in my mind without effort. It was not anger. It was clarity. I clicked back into the trust records and opened a new spreadsheet. My fingers typed without hesitation. I built columns for dates, amounts, transfer destinations, related filings, approval signatures. I imported every log I could access. For each withdrawal, I matched it to the corresponding line in the tax filings. For each filing, I noted the phrase, "reviewed by beneficiary." My name repeated over and over until the words blurred. When the spreadsheet was complete, I sat back and looked at it. It was undeniable. It was the kind of evidence that could not be excused as misunderstanding or clerical error. It was deliberate. I saved the file, then exported it. The prompt asked for a name. I typed slowly and deliberately, Blake Trust Evidence V1 Toin X LSX. As the export bar filled, I watched the colors move across the screen. I felt the weight of everything I had discovered condense into a single quiet thought. If they wanted me to carry this, I would carry it right to the people they feared the most. That night, I sat on my living room floor with the laptop closed and the lights off, except for a small lamp in the corner, and I pulled an old cardboard box from the back of my closet. It was the box I had packed when I left Folsom the first time, the box of things I could not quite throw away, even when I told myself I was done needing anything from that house. I set it in front of me and lifted the lid. Inside were photos stacked in loose bundles, ticket stubs, a few birthday cards, small objects that would look like trash to anyone else. I picked up a photo from the top of the pile. It was from my 16th birthday. The image caught my brother mid-grin, standing next to a used car in the driveway with a bow on the hood. My father had an arm slung proudly around his shoulders. My mother stood slightly behind them, smiling. In the corner of the frame, I could see myself smaller, not centered, holding a paper plate with a slice of cake. I remembered the moment clearly because of what my father had said when I asked if I would ever get a car like that. You do not need a car. You will marry a man who has one. He had laughed when he said it, as if it were a harmless joke, and everyone else had laughed with him. The sting of it had settled quietly in my chest, and I had swallowed it down with frosting and soda, because arguing never changed anything. Now in my apartment, years later, with trust records and IRS notices, still vivid in my mind, the old, familiar sting felt different. It connected. 16 and told I did not need independence. 21 and poured champagne until I could not stand. 29 and discovering a $4.2 million trust tied to my name so they could keep their own hands clean. I set the photo aside and dug deeper into the box. There were acceptance letters from colleges, some with scholarship offers, some without. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table while my mother and father pored over paperwork for Evan's college fund. They talked about contribution limits and growth projections and how proud they were to be able to give him a head start. When it was my turn to choose a school, the tone was different. Loans exist for a reason, Nora. You are smart. You will figure it out. They said it like they were praising my resilience. But what they meant was, we are not investing in you the way we invested in him. So I had pieced together my education through scholarships, part-time jobs, and federal loans, while continuing to help at home whenever they asked. I had told myself it was fair because Evan was the oldest, or because he was going into something my parents understood better. It was easier to believe excuses than to sit with the raw truth that I was always the expendable one. I picked up another photo. This one was older edges, curling colors slightly faded. I was maybe 12, standing at the edge of the frame while my father and Evan examined a brochure for a rental property. I remembered that day, too. I had asked what it meant to own a second house, and my father had barely glanced at me when he answered, "Real estate shares trust. That is man's work. Do not worry your pretty head." At the time, I had felt an almost childish shame for even asking, as if my curiosity had been an inconvenience. Now that sentence echoed over the image of my falsified signature on trust documents and the note, "reviewed by beneficiary." The pattern snapped into focus. My entire life I had been kept out of conversations about assets and plans, while at the same time being quietly positioned to absorb risk when it suited them. In every story my family told about itself, Evan was the main character, and I was the supporting role who showed up to help, to cover, to sign, to understand, without ever being fully seen. My chest felt tight, but no tears came. There was nothing left in me that wanted to cry for the version of my father who had never actually existed outside my hope. Instead, I felt something else, something like a cord snapping cleanly inside me, the image of a protective father of a family that would never truly harm its own simply fell away. In its place was something simpler and crueler. They had used what they thought was my invisibility to their advantage. I sifted further through the box until my fingers brushed another photograph. This one was different. In it, I stood in a group of people in business attire on a balcony with the San Francisco skyline behind us. I was in the middle for once, laughing at something someone had said. Behind us, barely visible unless you knew to look, was the logo of a large law firm printed on the glass door. My father had never seen this photo. My family barely understood what I did, let alone who I did it for. To them, I was the girl who worked with computers, who stayed quiet, who showed up when they needed a favor. They never saw the part of my life where attorneys trusted me with cases involving companies worth more than the house I grew up in. Looking at the logo now, I felt a small current of strength run under the weariness. If I was invisible to them, then so were my limits. I set the photo down and reached for my phone. There was one person who knew exactly what those trust records meant and how they would look in the eyes of the law, someone my family did not know I kept in my corner. I scrolled to her name and paused for a brief moment, then decided to call the one person they would never expect me to involve. The next morning, I drove to Midtown Sacramento and parked in front of a small coffee shop tucked between a florist and a boutique. It was early enough that only a few people sat scattered across the room, each absorbed in their own quiet routines. The faint sound of steaming milk and soft music filled the space as I walked in. Hannah Park was already there at a corner table, a stack of legal pads beside her latte. She'd always arrived early to everything, even in college, and seeing her now with that same focused calm steadied something inside me. She looked up and her expression shifted instantly from friendly recognition to sharp concern. I sat across from her and placed a folder on the table. I did not bother with pleasantries. I simply said, "I need your eyes on this." She opened the folder, pulling out the photocopy of the trust document, the bank logs, and the IRS notice. The more she read, the tighter her jaw became. I watched her trace the signature at the bottom of the trust copy, the one that claimed to be mine. She glanced up. "Nora, this is not your handwriting. It is an older style. Someone tried to mimic your signature from years ago." She flipped to the next page. "And this filing here is recent. This signature does not match the documents you signed at the firm last year. All of this looks like someone used your name deliberately." My throat felt tight, but I kept my voice steady. "So it is fraud." She nodded slowly, eyes still scanning the documents. "Fraud and misrepresentation. And because your name is on these filings, the IRS will assume you reviewed and approved everything unless you take action. If you stay silent, they could treat you as a participant, which carries civil and sometimes criminal penalties." The words landed heavily, even though part of me had expected them. She lifted the bank logs and tapped several lines. These amounts: $120,000, $250,000, $400,000, all marked as loans to Blake Logistics, LLC. "That is your brother's company, right?" I nodded. She continued, "These are not minor sums. The trust is being used as a funding source. And because the trust is currently valued at $4.2 million, the IRS will absolutely want to know why the beneficiary's approval was logged on every transaction." She turned the page toward me. "They did not just steal your name. They rented your future to pay their bills." Something inside me shifted at those words. For the first time, I felt the weight of everything that had been done to me, and yet also the sharp, undeniable truth that I held the leverage now. I was a victim of what they had orchestrated, but I also held the evidence. And evidence was power. In a way, my family never understood. Hannah looked at me carefully. "You have two choices, Nora. One, pretend this never happened and risk being held liable. Or 2, bring this to the authorities with a full audit trail. I leaned back slightly and felt a strange clarity settle into place. The quiet part of me that had always complied was gone. Something stronger had taken its place. She flipped her legal pad open. I know you understand what this means legally, but do you understand what it means for you personally? I let out a breath and nodded. She did not know that I had spent the last few years assisting attorneys with fraud cases far more complex than this one. She did not know that I had traced hidden accounts for corporations that thought they could outsmart the law. She only knew the surface of what I did at work, so I lifted the edge of my laptop bag and set another folder on the table. Cases I helped you with. The ones involving corporate misrepresentations over $5 million. She blinked in surprise. You kept these. I kept the methods. Her eyes widened slightly as she understood what I meant. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Nora, you are a lot more equipped for this than most people. I nodded once. I know. And that was the moment when the fear that had been sitting in my chest loosened. My family never knew who I really was. They thought I was quiet because I was weak. They never considered that I was quiet because silence lets you see patterns clearly. We spent the next hour creating a list. We wrote down every document I needed from the IRS portal, every log that needed to be time-stamped and exported, every recording, including the one on my smartwatch and the one I planned to obtain when I next visited their house. We noted the financial filings for the trust, the copies with mismatched signatures, the exact dates of the withdrawals, and then the timing of the confrontation. Christmas. I said the word quietly. They invited me weeks ago. The whole family will be there. Hannah looked up sharply. You want witnesses. I want the truth where it cannot be denied. She sat back thinking. Christmas gatherings are tense enough, Nora. Are you sure you want to do this then? Her question hung in the air. I felt the memory of my father pointing a knife at me on Christmas night and telling me to leave the table. I felt the years of being told I did not need independence or assets or a future that belonged to me. And then I felt the clarity of what I had discovered. I met her eyes. They taught me holidays were for pretending. I am done pretending. That answer seemed to settle everything. Hannah closed the folder gently. Then we prepare. And when the day comes, you do not flinch. I nodded again and felt something unfamiliar rising in my chest. Strength. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. A quiet force my family had never expected from me. By the time October rolled around, I had gathered enough documents to outline the entire structure of what my family had done, but what I still needed was their own words. Hannah had been clear that recorded statements could close any gaps in intent. So one evening after work, I drove to Folsom with a folder in my hand and a calm expression on my face. My mother opened the door with her usual bright greeting, surprised but pleased that I had stopped by on a weeknight. I told them I needed to check a few papers for work and that I thought Dad might remember something useful about old financial forms. The lie came easily because it was close enough to the truth. I stepped into the living room where my father sat in his usual recliner with the television muted. I sat on the edge of the sofa, angled just enough to face him. My smartwatch screen glowed briefly as I pressed the hidden record function, and I slid a little closer so the microphone would catch every word. I waited a moment, then spoke in a tone deliberately light. Dad, what happens to the trust if something goes wrong? He let out a long sigh, the kind that implied he was about to explain simple things to someone who should already know them. If the IRS looks, they see your name, not mine. That is how this works. He said it as casually as one might mention the weather, as if he were stating a fact everyone agreed on. I kept my face neutral, though my pulse jumped. Before I could respond, Evan walked into the room holding a sports drink. He must have caught the tail end of the sentence because he laughed and added exactly in that effortless way he always had when talking about money he had not earned. We keep the assets, she keeps the risk. The words came out so quickly he probably did not even realize how much he was revealing. I did not react, not even with a blink. I leaned back slightly as if satisfied with the answer, though my stomach tightened. My mother stepped into the room, then carrying 2 dessert plates with slices of pie, and she set one in front of me with a joking smile. Do not scare her. She will never understand this money stuff anyway. Her voice held the same tone she used when dismissing my questions as a teenager. To her, it was harmless teasing. To me, it was another thread woven into the pattern that had brought us here. I smiled back politely, though her words settled like cold stones in my chest. For several minutes, I let the conversation drift to harmless topics, while I kept my wrist angled toward my father and brother. Every small detail, every careless phrase, every assumption they spoke aloud was being captured clearly. When the conversation began to die down, I stood and gathered my things, thanking them for the pie. My father nodded distractedly, already turning his attention back to the television, while my mother followed me to the door, adjusting her sweater as she walked. You work too much, Nora, she said warmly, as if she had not just made a joke about my supposed inability to understand the financial mess they had dropped onto my name. I hugged her lightly and stepped into the night air. It was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a truth has been spoken aloud for the first time. When I reached my car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, letting the tension leave my body. There was a new heaviness in my chest, but it felt more like confirmation than fear. At home, I placed my bag on the floor, went straight to my desk, and opened my laptop. I connected my smartwatch and waited for the audio file to transfer. When the waveform appeared on the editing screen, I pressed play and listened to my father's voice echo through the speakers. If the IRS looks, they see your name, not mine. That is how this works. Followed by Evan's almost cheerful confirmation. We keep the assets, she keeps the risk. My mother's laugh trailed after them like an afterthought. Do not scare her. She will never understand this money stuff anyway. Hearing it a second time made my skin prickle. There was no misunderstanding, no possibility of misinterpretation. It was direct. It was intentional. And it was exactly the kind of evidence Hannah needed to build the next phase. I saved the audio file, then created 2 backups. One went to an encrypted cloud folder. The second I labeled with a simple name and sent to Hannah with a short message. Uploaded. Clear statements from both. After the email sent, I exported another copy to an external drive locked in my desk. When all 3 backups were complete, I returned to the waveform on my screen and watched it stretch across the timeline, each spike of sound marking another piece of truth they could never take back. I leaned closer and whispered the words slowly, letting them anchor the moment. You just signed your own statement, Dad. Early December arrived with a thin layer of fog over Sacramento and the feeling of something tightening around the edges of my life. I had not spoken to my parents since the night I recorded my father and Evan spelling out exactly how they had used my name to shield themselves, but the silence did not last long. One Thursday afternoon, my phone lit up with my father's name. His voice when I answered was firm rather than warm, a tone that suggested expectation instead of invitation. We are having Christmas dinner here. 6:30. Be on time. It was phrased like a request, yet delivered like a command. For a moment, I let the quiet stretch, listening to the hum of my apartment heater, letting him wait. I will be there, I finally said, and he hung up without another word. I set the phone down and sat still, recognizing the shift in myself. Months earlier, I would have felt dread coil in my stomach. Now all I felt was clarity. I knew exactly what they had done. I knew what they counted on me not knowing, and I knew what I would bring with me when I walked through their door on Christmas night. A few days after that call, I opened social media during a break at work and found Evan's latest post. A new luxury car sat in a dealership showroom ribbon draped across the hood. The caption read, "Grind pays off," followed by a handful of motivational hashtags. Another photo showed a confirmation for a tropical vacation, booked for early spring. I stared at the images for a long moment. My brother had never hidden his love for expensive things, but seeing him reward himself publicly while knowing exactly where the money had come from made something settle even colder in my chest. None of it was funded by grind. None of it was earned. It was drawn from the same trust they had buried under my name to keep themselves insulated. I closed the app and leaned back in my chair. Their arrogance was not surprising anymore. It was only data. And data, when collected long enough, always formed a pattern. The next morning, before leaving for work, I checked my email and froze when I saw the sender. It was from a major law firm in San Francisco, the kind whose offices overlooked the Bay and whose reputation stretched well beyond California. They thanked me for my previous collaboration on fraud analysis and offered me a position as senior forensic consultant with a compensation package in the six-figure range. I reread the email twice. They were offering me a future completely separate from my family's version of me, a quiet girl who should not bother with money matters. I did not click accept. I did not decline either. I simply let the offer sit there as proof that whatever identity my parents built for me had no power outside their house. That knowledge alone felt like another kind of armor. That evening, I pulled up the shared folder Hannah and I had created. In it was a draft email we had written together weeks earlier. Everything was laid out plainly in the body of the message. Attached were the logs, the false filings, the copies of the trust statements, and the recordings proving my father and brother admitted to using my name intentionally. The recipients were already filled in. IRS, State Franchise Tax Board. The subject line read, "Evidence of Misrepresentation Blake Family Trust." All that remained was pressing send. I hovered my finger over the trackpad but did not click. Timing mattered. Public exposure mattered. Having witnesses mattered. Hannah and I had agreed that Christmas night would provide all three, so I closed the draft without sending it and messaged Hannah instead. "Are you available Christmas evening if needed?" Her reply arrived 20 seconds later. "Yes, phone on, ready." I thanked her and shut my laptop. With everything set in motion, the days leading up to Christmas passed in a surreal calm. I went to work. I bought groceries. I wrapped a small gift for a coworker. Nothing about my routine changed except the knowledge that my family believed I would come home silent and compliant the way I always had. On Christmas afternoon, I stood in my bedroom staring at the clothes in my closet. Most of what I owned was practical and neutral, but for once I cared less about appearance and more about symbolism. I chose a simple dark dress that fell cleanly at the knee, something that neither invited attention nor shrank from it. I brushed my hair, applied minimal makeup, and studied my reflection. My face looked familiar, yet sharpened as if months of truth had carved new angles. I picked up my phone, checked the time, then opened the encrypted folder where every piece of evidence was stored. Everything was intact. Everything was ready. I slipped the phone into my bag and reached for my coat. Before leaving the room, I paused in front of the mirror, meeting my own eyes in the glass. The apartment around me was quiet. Outside the window, the early winter sky had already begun to darken. I listened to the steady rhythm of my breathing, the steadiness of someone who finally saw her life without distortion. "Tonight I am not their daughter," I said softly. "I am their audit." Christmas night in Folsom carried the kind of cold that settled into the bones of the house. Lights framed the windows. The smell of roasted turkey filled the dining room, and every seat at the long table was taken. 2 aunts, one Uncle Evan's wife and their 2 children, filled the space with small talk, while my parents moved around with the pride of hosts who believed they were presenting a perfect family. I took my place quietly, my phone in my bag, my smartwatch warm on my wrist. My heartbeat was steady. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind for weeks. My father lifted his glass and began retelling the same story he always pulled out during holidays. We built everything from nothing. We did it right. It was meant to sound humble, but it was delivered with the practiced authority of a man who wanted acknowledgement from every direction. I kept my expression blank as Evan leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Some of us keep moving forward," he said casually. "Some people stay stuck. At least try Nora. Own a house before you are 40. Start a family or something." His wife glanced at him uneasily but said nothing. The two aunts exchanged looks. My uncle cleared his throat awkwardly. The warmth of the food did nothing to soften the coldness spreading through the room. It continued like that for several minutes, small barbs disguised as jokes, subtle reminders of my status in this family. When plates were passed and forks began scraping the surface of mashed potatoes, my father finally turned to me. His voice sharpened without warning. "If you are going to sit here sulking, leave the table." Silence cracked through the room. No one defended me. Not one person asked why he was speaking that way. Evan picked up his wine glass, studying me with an amused tilt of his head. My mother pushed peas around her plate and avoided my eyes. The expectation was familiar. I was supposed to shrink, apologize, step away from the table like I had done so many times in the past. Instead, I placed my napkin on the table and stood up slowly. Every movement felt controlled, deliberate. I reached into my bag and set my phone upright in front of my empty plate. "Since we are talking about what we built, maybe they should hear how you built it." My voice was steady and soft, yet it cut through the silence more sharply than any shout could. My father's brows pulled together in confusion. Evan let out a scoff as if he expected me to embarrass myself. My aunts leaned in. My uncle paused mid-bite. I tapped the screen. The recording played instantly. "The trust is $4.2 million. Her name keeps us safe. If anything blows up, we blame the kid." My father's voice echoed through the dining room with sickening clarity. The scrape of forks stopped. Chairs shifted. One of Evan's children looked up from a plate of sweet potatoes, startled. My mother pressed her hand to her chest as if she had been physically hit. Evan's wife whispered, "What is he talking about?" to no one in particular. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again as if searching for a version of events that could survive the presence of witnesses. I did not interrupt him. I let the silence do its work. Then I reached for the envelope I had placed inside my bag earlier. I pulled out the printed IRS notice, the transaction logs, the highlighted list of withdrawals. I placed them on the table one sheet at a time. Every line was crisp. Every number stood out in fluorescent yellow. Payments to Blake Logistics, LLC. Withdrawals of $120,000, $250,000, $400,000. All processed under the tax filings labeled "Reviewed by Beneficiary Nora Blake." I did not lift my eyes as my aunts read the papers. My uncle leaned forward, squinting at the figures. Evan's wife covered her mouth. My father looked smaller with every passing second. Evan shifted in his seat, color draining from his face. "That is impossible," he muttered. "She does not even understand this stuff." A weak defense, an even weaker strategy. The evidence lay in front of them like a mirror they could not escape. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing violently. "Nora, turn it off," he said, almost whispering it. His voice no longer carried authority. It carried fear. My mother reached for my arm, but her hand froze halfway. It was the first time she had ever seemed unsure around me. I stood completely still, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Everyone was watching now. Every adult at the table understood exactly what the recording and documents meant. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a clerical error. It was intentional. They had used my name to shelter their money. They had risked my future to protect theirs. I looked directly at my father, meeting his eyes without blinking. "Dad, should I hit send now, or would you like to explain first?" The words floated across the table quietly, but the meaning landed like a strike. My phone screen glowed beside my plate, ready to open the drafted email addressed to the IRS and the State Franchise Tax Board. The entire table seemed to hold its breath. Chairs stilled, glasses stopped mid-air. It was the first time in my life the silence belonged to me. Immediately after the words left my mouth, the room seemed to tilt. My father lurched to his feet so quickly, his chair scraped back against the hardwood floor. His face flushed, a deep red as he reached across the table toward my phone. "Nora, give me that. Turn it off right now." His voice was no longer controlled. It was loud and ragged, and for a second I saw fear more than anger in his eyes. I stepped back just out of his reach, the chair behind me blocking his path. "You cannot play games with this," he hissed. "These people do not need to hear about family business." Around us, no one moved. My aunt stared at the documents. My uncle looked from the recordings to my father with open disbelief. Evan half rose from his chair, then froze as if he could not decide whether to defend our father or save himself. I did not raise my voice. I simply unlocked my phone with my thumb and opened the drafted email Hannah and I had prepared. The subject line: Evidence of Misrepresentation. Blake Family Trust stared back at me, along with the attached files, the logs, the recordings, the false filings. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I pressed send. The soft whoosh of the email leaving felt louder than his shouting. "It is done," I said quietly. "There is nothing left to turn off." For a second, no one spoke. Then the room erupted. My father slammed his fist against the table, making the plates jump. "You ungrateful child," he shouted. "After everything we have done for you, you stand here and report your own family. How dare you?" The words hit me, but did not sink the way they once would have. My aunts shifted in their seats, exchanging looks that clearly said this had gone too far. My uncle cleared his throat. "Charles, this is serious. You cannot just use her name like that." Evan finally found his voice, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You will destroy us. Do you understand that? You will destroy everything." I turned toward him. "I did not destroy anything. I just stopped hiding what you already did." My mother whispered, "Nora, please," and clutched her napkin so tightly her knuckles went white. But she still did not deny what the evidence showed. The room that had once felt like the center of our holidays now felt like a courtroom. Every person present was a witness. They had heard the recording. They had seen the numbers. There was no taking any of it back. My father kept pacing the narrow space between his chair and the wall, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You have no idea what the government can do," he spat. "They will come after all of us." I met his eyes steadily. "They will go after the people who lied." I could feel the years of swallowed words pushing against my ribs, asking to be released, but I held them. This was not the time for every hurt. This was about the trust, the filings, and the names on those lines. One of my aunts finally spoke up, her voice shaking. "Is this true, Charles? Did you really put everything in her name?" He did not answer directly. Instead, he turned back to me. "You did not have to send that email. We could have fixed this quietly. You chose to betray your family." The word betray hung in the air. I thought of every time I had signed something, because he told me it was routine. Every time I had been told finances were man's work. Every time my college debt had been dismissed while Evan's car and trips were celebrated. I straightened my shoulders. I chose not to take the fall for something I never agreed to. That is not betrayal. That is survival. Evan knocked back the rest of his drink and slammed the glass down too hard. "You will regret this," he muttered. "When the government freezes things, when the bank calls, when the company takes a hit, you will see." I simply picked up the envelope of documents and slid them back into my bag. "The bank will call, because they should," I replied. With that, I stepped away from the table. No one tried to stop me this time. In the entryway, I slipped on my coat with slow, deliberate movements while the sounds of raised voices spilled from the dining room. Halfway to my car, I heard the front door open behind me and my uncle's voice calling softly, "Nora." I turned. He looked shaken but resolute. "For what it is worth, you did the right thing," he said quietly. Then he went back inside, leaving me alone on the walkway under the cold Christmas sky. That night, back in my apartment, I placed my phone on the coffee table and stared at it for a long time. My chest felt hollow, but steady. They would call me a traitor. They would say I had ruined them. But the truth was I had simply refused to let them ruin me. The next morning, the fallout began. Midway through making coffee, my phone buzzed with an unknown number that turned out to be a representative from the bank that handled several of Evan's business loans. They were conducting a routine review, the caller said, but the questions were pointed. Had I been aware of the trust being used as collateral? Had I personally guaranteed any obligations? I answered carefully, explaining that I had only recently learned my name had been used and that I had raised concerns with the proper authorities. There was a pause, and then the representative said in a clipped professional tone that some of the accounts might be placed under review while they verified information. After the call ended, I checked my email. A new message from the IRS sat at the top of my inbox acknowledging receipt of the materials I had sent. They would be reviewing the evidence for potential misrepresentation related to the Blake family trust. The words were brief and formal, but they carried the weight of real consequences. Several days passed in a strange quiet. I went to work. I kept my head down. I ignored the flurry of messages from extended relatives who had clearly heard varying versions of what had happened. Some were angry, some confused, some cautiously supportive. Through it all, my parents and Evan stayed silent. Then one afternoon, as I was leaving the office, my phone buzzed with a new text from Hannah. They opened an investigation. This will not be quick, but it will be real. 3 weeks passed before they showed up at my door. I had just come home from work and was setting my bag down when a sudden sharp knock echoed through the apartment. Not a polite tap, a pounding filled with urgency and something close to desperation. When I opened the door, my father stood there with Evan behind him, both looking smaller than I had ever seen them. Neither had called first. Neither had asked permission to come. They simply arrived as if my life were still a space they could walk into without earning the right. My father stepped forward immediately. "Nora, we need to talk." His tone was clipped and defensive, not humble, as though he were trying to recover a position he no longer held. I stepped aside, but only far enough for them to enter the small living room. The apartment felt even quieter with them, standing in it, both glancing around, as if confused by its simplicity. My father cleared his throat and folded his hands together. "It was just paperwork," he began. His voice tried for steady but frayed around the edges. "Families do this all the time. People sign for each other. They help each other. It was not meant to hurt you." I watched him closely, not because his words were persuasive, but because it was strange to see him attempt justification instead of command. My father had never explained himself in his life. Yet he stood in my living room spinning excuses like thread that could not hold weight. Evan spoke next, and his voice cracked on the first word. "I am losing everything." He rubbed his palms over his eyes. 2 contracts dropped this week. The bank froze 1 line of credit. They think I lied on my filings. They think I used the trust illegally. He shook his head as if expecting me to comfort him. I remained still. "You will destroy us," he said, repeating the accusation from Christmas, but with far less fire this time. It sounded more like pleading. I kept my arms relaxed at my sides. "You destroyed yourselves." They blinked at me, as if the sentence were in another language. My father exhaled sharply and reached into his coat. He pulled out a thin folder, the edges worn from being handled too much. "We brought something for you to sign," he said, pushing it toward me. "It will correct the misunderstanding. We just need to adjust a few statements, a few filings. Nothing major. It only makes official what everyone already assumed. Just say you reviewed the documents. Say you approved the transactions. It is a technicality." His voice softened artificially. "You can save the family from this." Evan nodded eagerly. "If you sign it, the bank will release my accounts. The IRS will ease off. The company can stabilize. You can fix this." I took the folder but did not open it right away. The weight of it felt wrong in my hand, a trap disguised as reconciliation. When I finally opened it, I found exactly what I expected. Pages drafted to shift partial responsibility to me, sentences written to suggest I had participated in managing the trust, lines that would bind me legally to every number they had manipulated. "You want me to sign away my own protection," I said quietly. "This is not fixing anything. This is transferring the fall." My father stiffened. "Do not say it like that. You are making this bigger than it is. These are standard corrections. Families stand together on things like this." He leaned closer. "We gave you a roof. We fed you. You owe us at least this. The old script, the old leverage." I felt no sting from it now. Something inside me had settled into clarity. I closed the folder calmly and placed it on the coffee table. I am not signing. Evan stared at me as if he could not comprehend hearing the word no from me. "You do not understand," he said. "My business will not survive this. I can lose the house, the car, everything." His voice broke into a sob. I almost felt something soften, but then I remembered the logs, the withdrawals, the carefree posts about grind paying off, the sentence where he had told my father, "We keep the assets, she keeps the risk." My father tried again, shifting to what he thought was a gentler tone. "We can negotiate. Tell us what you want." I shook my head. "You need lawyers, not me." There was a long silence. I watched the realization spread across their faces that I truly meant it, that I was not bending this time, that the person they had shaped into a quiet background character no longer existed. Then I spoke one more truth they were not prepared for. "I have an offer from a law firm in San Francisco, senior forensic consultant, 6-figure compensation." I said it simply stating a fact, not bragging, but the effect was immediate. Evan went still. My father's jaw tightened. I continued before they could twist the moment. "I do not depend on this family, financially or otherwise. Not anymore." My father's expression hardened with something sharp and resentful. "So this is about money?" "No," I answered. "This is about accountability." He stared at me for several long seconds, then slowly straightened. He seemed to be gathering whatever pride he had left. He took a step toward the door. Evan followed, wiping his face with his sleeve. My father placed his hand on the doorknob, then paused. When he turned back, his eyes were cold in a way that used to hurt, but now only clarified truth. "You are no daughter of mine." The words came out low and final. For a brief moment, I felt the echo of old wounds, but it faded quickly. I walked toward the door and closed it gently after they stepped into the hallway. As the latch clicked, I whispered to myself, he finally said out loud what he treated me like my whole life. Then I stood in the quiet of my apartment and let the silence settle without pain. The fog over San Francisco Bay hung low and soft the afternoon I finally let myself stand still, long enough to feel everything that had happened. I stood at the edge of a pier watching the water move in slow, restless patterns and the city rise in glass and steel on the other side. The air smelled like salt and cold metal, and somewhere behind me, a ferry horn sounded distant and unbothered. My phone was in my pocket, silent for once. The emails had already come. The calls already finished the investigation that began with one quiet click of send had run its course. The IRS had confirmed what I knew the night I opened that envelope in my small Sacramento kitchen. The signatures were not mine. The filings that claimed I had reviewed and approved the trust activity were falsified. The trail of withdrawals labeled as loans to Blake Logistics LLC told a clear story. My father and Evan were named as the ones who conceived and directed the scheme to use my name as a shield while they pulled money out of the Blake family trust. The letters described it in formal language, but underneath the official tone, it came down to something simple. They had treated my future like a disposable resource. The trust itself did not disappear. It was not seized entirely or burned to the ground. Instead, it was taken apart and rebuilt. Under the guidance of attorneys who had no patience for sentiment, it was restructured into a protected arrangement, one that recognized me as the real beneficiary without forcing me to stand in front of any more damage. My responsibility ended at truth. Their responsibility began with consequences. My father was required to pay a significant penalty numbers large enough that even he could not talk his way around them. To satisfy what he owed, he sold off investments he once boasted about at holiday dinners, pieces of property that had featured in his speeches about how he built everything from nothing. Evan did not fare better. His company, already unstable beneath the surface, could not survive the sudden scrutiny and the banking pressure. Contracts slipped away, lines of credit closed. In the end, he declared bankruptcy, and the house and the car he had shown off online under the caption "Grind pays off" both went on the market not as trophies, but as collateral. None of it made me smile. It simply felt accurate, like numbers aligning on a page after a long string of errors. When the dust settled and the new version of the trust was in place, I found myself in a position I had never been allowed to imagine. I had access not to all of the $4.2 million at once, but to something better, a structure that would not collapse if someone else decided to be careless. I sat at my kitchen table one night with the paperwork spread out and made two choices that mattered only to me. With one portion, I paid off every dollar of my student loans, the debt I had carried alone while my family poured trust money into Evan's ventures. The relief was quiet and deep. No celebration, just the simple uncoiling of a knot I had lived with for years. With another portion, I funded a small trust of my own, nothing enormous, by the standards of the cases I had worked, but enough to matter. It was dedicated to women whose families had used them as financial shields or sources, women who had been asked to sign things they did not understand under the banner of trust and duty. It felt right that some of the money that had been used to trap me would be redirected to help other people step out of their own traps. I did not call my father or Evan to tell them any of this. Our contact had dwindled to a few short, formal updates through attorneys, and there was nothing more I needed from them. San Francisco had become more than just a possible job on a screen. I had accepted the offer. My days were now spent in offices that looked out over the bay, where partners asked for my input and listened when I spoke, where my skill with patterns and hidden trails was not a threat to anyone's ego, but a resource they relied on. My life became smaller in some ways and larger in others. Fewer holidays, more quiet evenings, fewer obligations, more choices. Standing on the pier, I watched the water move and felt a strange, gentle peace settle in. I thought of the girl who once believed that love meant staying at the table no matter how many times she was told to leave. I thought of the woman who finally stood up, pressed play, and refused to carry a lie any further. It would have been easy to frame what happened as revenge, a fire set to punish the people who hurt me. But as I looked out at the city and felt the weight slide off my shoulders, I realized that was never really what I had done. I did not burn my family down. I just stopped letting them burn me to keep their house warm. Justice in my story did not arrive with shouting or grand scenes after that Christmas night. It arrived slowly in letters and statements, and in the quiet decisions I made when no one was watching, in the way I chose to use what was finally mine. There are still days when old habits tug at me, when I hear a voice in the back of my mind telling me to sit down and keep the peace. But it fades faster each time I remember the cost of silence. For the first time in my life, my worth was not defined by what I could sign for someone else or what I could quietly absorb. It was defined by what I chose to walk away from and what I chose to build for myself. So I am curious. If someone used your name to hide their mess, would you stay at the table or finally walk away?